Cape Town, December 2019. In the narrow streets of Salt River, the sound of automatic gunfire shattered the night. Rashied Staggie, one of the most feared and notorious gang leaders South Africa has ever known, lay bleeding in the road. For some, his death brought relief. For others, it left a dangerous vacuum. And for the country, it raised questions that remain unanswered. Who ordered the hit and why? Was it revenge, betrayal, or just the inevitable end of a man who lived by the gun? This is the story of Rashied Staggie, his rise, his crimes, the divided legacy he left behind, and the unsolved murder that closed the chapter on one of Cape Town's darkest figures. Before we dive into the story, please take a moment to subscribe to Unsolved Murders SA. We'd also appreciate it if you followed our sister podcast, Crime Central SA, where we cover some of South Africa's most shocking criminal cases. If you enjoy our work and want to support independent journalism, please consider sending us a donation. Even something as small as the price of a cup of coffee goes a long way. You'll find the link in the description. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and shining a light on the violence and corruption that still haunt our nation. Also, please note, the views, information, or opinions expressed in this series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Swisher Post, its parent company, Isherwood Publications, or its partners. Some of the content featured in the series contains graphic descriptions of violence. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Rashied Staggie's story begins not with violence, but with poverty. Born in 1966 in the Cape Flats, his childhood was defined by deprivation and survival. The apartheid government's forced removals had turned their flats into a dumping ground for the displaced, a barren stretch of sand where crime, drugs, and gangs thrived in the absence of opportunity. For the children who grew up there, the choice was stark: become a victim or join the predators. From an early age, Rashied and his twin brother Rashied gravitated towards the streets. They were restless, ambitious, and unwilling to accept the smallness of life handed to them. The brothers quickly became enforcers in their neighborhood, feared for their willingness to use violence and admired for their audacity. They learned that fists could open doors, knives could silence rivals, and loyalty to the gang meant survival. By the late 1980s, Rashied and Rashied had transformed themselves from street-level thugs into the co-founders of what would become one of South Africa's most notorious criminal empires, the Hard Livings Gang. The name itself was a declaration of identity. A gang born from hardship, hardened by violence, and living by rules that rejected the state's authority. The Hard Livings were more than a gang. They became an institution. Their influence spread through Manenberg, Hanover Park, and beyond, a network built on drug trafficking, protection rackets, and extortion. But their reach was not only criminal. They became a cultural force in the Cape Flats, recruiting young men in droves, offering them a sense of belonging, power, and brotherhood. In a place where the government had abandoned its citizens, the Hard Livings filled the void. Rashied was at the heart of it all, charismatic, cunning, and utterly ruthless. His reputation was a dual-edged sword. To his enemies, he was a gangster who ruled with iron fists and blood-stained hands. To some in his community, he was a benefactor, a man who distributed food parcels, sponsored funerals, and paid for school fees. Mothers whose children might otherwise have starved spoke of him with gratitude, even as they knew he peddled the drugs that destroy other families on the same street. This duality, savior and destroyer, protector and predator, defined Rashied Staggie. He embodied the paradox of gang leaders in South Africa, men who prey on their own communities while simultaneously providing for them. That contradiction earned him both loyalty and loathing in equal measure. But Staggie's life was also marked by public humiliation and retribution. In August 1996, his twin brother Rashied Staggie was dragged into the street by members of the vigilante group People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, or PAGAT. In a scene broadcast across the country, Rashied was beaten, shot, and set alight. His screams echoed through Salt River as the crowd cheered, a moment that symbolized the rage of communities tired of being held hostage by gang lords. For Rashied, it was both a personal tragedy and a warning. His own life would likely end the same way, violently, publicly, and without mercy. Still, Rashied continued to reign. His wealth grew, his reputation stretched across Cape Town, and his name became synonymous with both fear and reverence. He survived assassination attempts, arrests, and prison stints. In 2003, he was convicted of the kidnapping and gang rape of a woman suspected of being a police informant alongside fellow gang member Randall Bosch. The victim testified via closed-circuit television, hidden from sight for her own safety. Rashied was sentenced to 15 years in prison. His appeal years later collapsed in failure. The Supreme Court of Appeal in 2011 struck the case from the roll after years of delay, calling the process a disgrace to the justice system. Bosch was murdered before the appeal could be heard. Rashied's conviction stood, staining forever his image as more than a gangster, as a predator who used fear and power to violate not only communities but individuals. Prison changed Staggie, at least outwardly. He emerged claiming to have found religion, projecting himself as a reformed man. He attended church services, spoke of peace, and even collaborated on community upliftment initiatives. He promised to steer young men away from gangs, to rebuild what had been broken, and to some extent he delivered. Food drives, public apologies, community events. Staggie knew how to play the role of a redeemed figure. But beneath the surface, whispers persisted. The Hard Livings gang was still active, still powerful, and still associated with violence and drugs. While Rashied spoke of reform, he was still surrounded by the machinery of gang life. He was still a figure of influence in an underworld that does not allow easy exits. For many, his redemption was nothing more than a mask, a cover for a man who could never truly leave the life that defined him. By 2019, Rashied Staggie was a man living in contradiction. To some, he was a symbol of change, proof that even the most hardened gangster could soften. To others, he remained what he'd always been, a criminal whose hands were too stained with blood to ever be cleansed. And it was in this space, between redemption and retribution, that his life reached its violent end. To understand Rashied Staggie's life, you have to understand the gang he helped to create. The Hard Livings were not born in polished boardrooms or structured institutions. They were forged in the dust and violence of the Cape Flats, a product of apartments' forced removals, systemic poverty, and communities abandoned by the state. By the mid-1980s, the Cape Flats had become a war zone. Drugs flooded the streets, gangs controlled neighborhoods with military precision, and the state's answer was heavy-handed policing that targeted symptoms rather than causes. Into this environment stepped Rashied and his twin brother Rashied, who had already built reputations as enforcers. Together, they turned street violence into an organization. They named it the Hard Livings, a reflection of the survivalist creed that governed their world. The Hard Livings quickly grew into one of the largest gangs in South Africa. At their height, they commanded thousands of members. Their primary business was drug trafficking, mandrax, crack cocaine, heroin, all distributed through carefully controlled networks. But drugs were only part of their empire. They ran protection rackets, extorted businesses, and inserted themselves into nearly every aspect of Cape Town's underworld economy. Rashied and Rashied ruled as dual leaders, but they were more than just bosses. They became symbols of power. Their names carried weight across the flats. Mothers invoked them as threats to discipline unruly children. Politicians whispered their names when discussing community crises. Even the police knew that raiding Hard Living's territory meant risking bloodshed. The Hard Living's power was amplified by their brutal war with the Americans gang, their fiercest rivals. This conflict raged across Cape Town, leaving scores dead and entire neighborhoods caught in the crossfire. Shootings became daily occurrences. Streets turned into battlegrounds. Innocents were killed in the crossfire, but the gangs justified it as the cost of control. For Rashied, every life lost was a warning to his enemies. The Hard Livings would not be challenged. Yet paradoxically, Staggie was not just a gangster to his community, he was also a philanthropist. His criminal wealth funded food parcels, school uniforms, and community programs. Families who had nothing suddenly found themselves with rent paid, groceries delivered, and children cared for. To many, he was a Robin Hood figure, a man who took from the system and gave back to his people. His presence at funerals, his donations to churches, and his financial support of struggling families cemented this image. This duality created a strange relationship between Staggie and the communities he dominated. On one hand, he was a destroyer, flooding neighborhoods with drugs, recruiting young men into cycles of violence, and spreading fear with the knowledge that anyone could become collateral damage in a gang war. On the other hand, he was a provider, a figure who filled the void left by a failing state. For some, hating him was impossible, because to hate him meant rejecting the only source of help they had. But no amount of philanthropy could mask the blood on his hands. Staggie was implicated in countless acts of violence. The courts eventually caught up with him in 2003 when he was convicted of kidnapping and gang raping a woman suspected of being a police informant. The judgment was damaging. The court heard how the victim was lured, brutalized, and terrorized with the threat of death hanging over her. For this crime, Staggie was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. His appeal, plagued by delays and incompetence, collapsed in 2011. The conviction stood. Still, Staggie retained influence even behind bars. The hard livings did not crumble in his absence. They adapted, expanding their networks, branching into new rackets. When he emerged from prison, Rashied claimed to have been transformed. He publicly embraced Christianity, appeared in churches, and positioned himself as a reformed gangster seeking to bring peace to the Cape Flats. He partnered with community organizations, launched outreach programs, and spoke openly about ending gang wars. But to his rivals, this was a facade. His enemies saw him not as a redeemed man, but as a gangster still entrenched in underworld business. For them, his public philanthropy was camouflage for ongoing influence. And for many within the hard livings itself, his quote-unquote reform raised suspicions. To some, he was betraying the gang's ethos. To others, he was angling for power under a different banner. Either way, the contradictions stacked higher. The truth about Rashied Staggie lies in this duality. The saint and the sinner, the benefactor and the butcher, the man who gave with one hand and destroyed with the other. His life was not a story of redemption, nor was it a simple descent into crime. It was a balancing act between two worlds, and in the end, both demanded payment. By the end of 2019, the Cape Flats was bracing for change. The old gang lords were dying out, and a younger generation was rising. Alliances shifted, betrayals brewed, and power was in flux. Rashied Staggie, once untouchable, had become vulnerable, and when the moment came, it arrived as violently as the life he had lived. It was the evening of the 13th of December 2019 in the Cape Town suburb of Salt River. Rashied Staggie was seated in a Toyota Corolla outside a friend's house, the same streets where his twin brother had been murdered more than 2 decades earlier. He might have thought he had escaped that fate, that redemption and time had brought him peace, but fate has a cruel memory. At around 12:30 p.m., 2 men approached the vehicle. Witnesses recall the sudden eruption of automatic gunfire, the sound bouncing off narrow streets as bullets tore through the windshield and bodywork. Staggie was hit multiple times in the chest and head. Neighbors, shocked but not surprised, rushed out as the gunman vanished into the city's veins. In seconds, one of South Africa's most infamous gang leaders lay lifeless, his blood pooling into the tarmac of the neighborhood he once ruled. The symbolism was undeniable. Rashied Staggie had died on the same streets where his twin brother Rashied was murdered by Pagad vigilantes in 1996, set alight in one of the most infamous mob killings in South African history. The Staggie brothers' story had come full circle. Both twins, both feared and hated, both executed in Salt River. News of Rashied's assassination spread quickly. For some, his death brought a strange sense of relief. Communities long terrorized by the hard livings whispered that maybe the flats could finally breathe. For others, it ignited fear. A power vacuum this large would never remain empty. Rival gangs circled like vultures, and with the old guard gone, younger leaders were ready to seize control. Theories about his murder multiplied almost immediately. Some claimed it was revenge, that old enemies, perhaps even remnants of Pagad, had finally settled the score. Others suggested it was an inside job orchestrated by elements within the 28 gang, longtime rivals of the hard livings. Still, others pointed the finger at Nigerian drug syndicates, alleging that Staggie had defrauded them and that the assassination was payment collected in lead and blood. One theory carried particular weight: betrayal from within his own family. Reports suggested that factions inside the hard livings had grown resentful of Rashied's attempt at quote-unquote reform and community outreach. To them, he had softened, lost his edge, and endangered the empire. Killing him was not only punishment, but also a reset, a return to the ruthless business model that had built the gang in the first place. The assassination exposed how fragile the peace on the Cape Flats truly was. In the weeks following his murder, violence simmered as rivalries flared and alliances shifted. Yet surprisingly, there was also a strange quiet. Some analysts described it as an quote-unquote uneasy peace, gangs consolidating powers behind closed doors rather than waging open war. In death, Staggie had achieved what he could not in life: a temporary pause in bloodshed, brought not by negotiations, but by fear. The police response was slow, deliberate, and in the eyes of many, inadequate. No suspects were immediately arrested. The investigation dragged, clouded by the same challenges that had haunted similar cases: witness intimidation, corrupt officers, and the silence of the underworld. By 2020, the case was still unresolved. Officials admitted they were chasing multiple leads, but as time passed, the likelihood of justice seemed to fade. Meanwhile, Rashied's funeral was a spectacle. Held in Manenberg, it drew hundreds: gang members, community leaders, churchgoers, and curious onlookers. His coffin, draped in white, was carried through the streets by men in hard living's colors. Some mourned sincerely, others came for the show. It was not just the burial of a man, but the closing of a chapter. Cape Town had lost a figure who embodied both terror and charity, cruelty and compassion. As of today, Rashied Staggie's murder remains unsolved. Theories persist, rumors circulate, and whispers of betrayal continue to haunt the hard livings. His death, like his life, is layered in contradiction, celebrated by some, mourned by others, and feared for what it means in the balance of power across the Cape Flats. What is certain is this: Rashied Staggie did not escape the cycle he helped to create. He lived by the gun, ruled by the gun, and ultimately died by it. His assassination closed the story of one of South Africa's most notorious gangsters, but left the larger question of who now holds the keys to the empire he left behind. The life and death of Rashied Staggie are a mirror of the Cape Flats itself, a place where poverty births empires, where violence is currency, and where redemption is never guaranteed. He was both feared and loved, both destroyer and provider. To some, he was the gangster who poisoned communities with drugs and bloodshed. To others, he was the benefactor who fed hungry families, paid for funerals, and gave the forgotten a measure of dignity. But in the end, it was his contradictions that consumed him. His attempts at reform clashed with the ruthless world he once commanded. His philanthropy could not erase his past, and his murder, like his brothers before him, proved that in South Africa's underworld, there are no peaceful retirements, only violent endings. What remains is an unsolved murder, no mastermind brought to justice, no final word on whether it was revenge, betrayal, or underworld business, just silence, speculation, and the shadow of a man whose life was as complicated as the city he ruled. The streets of Salt River still whisper his name, not as a hero or a villain, but as a reminder of the cycle he never escaped, a cycle that still grips the Cape Flats in blood and fear. This is the story of Rashied Staggie. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsolved Murders SA. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and share it with friends and family. Don't forget to follow our sister show, Crime Central SA, where we cover South Africa's most shocking true crime cases. If you'd like to support our work and help us keep independent journalism alive, consider making a donation. Even the price of a cup of coffee makes a difference. You'll find the link in the description. Your support keeps these stories alive, shining a light on the darkness that too often goes unseen.